Hey, I'm Hannah Hamlin, and I am a physician and I have type 1 diabetes. I'm here to talk to you today about technology for type 1 diabetes specifically and how fear around it can hold us back from the benefits from it. And this video is really, I think, a topic we don't maybe talk about or see mentioned online as much as I see it when I talk to people one-on-one. And in fear of diabetes technology, whether that's insulin pump management or continuous glucose monitors, is really common, especially if someone has never used technology before and they're making that initial jump into it, or if someone has had an experience with a pump years ago that caused them to have a severe low or a severe high blood sugar and they're just having trouble trusting it, which is completely makes sense. One of the things that I see often too is that it can be so hard to outsource a little bit of the data or the actions of our diabetes care to something else, because we know that taking care of ourselves is so important, and we understand that when we have errors in care, it can lead to adverse outcomes, things that we don't want to happen, low lows or high highs. And so really wanting to manage our diabetes and keep it in range makes sense. And so it's completely human nature, in my opinion, to have hesitancy when thinking about outsourcing some of those decisions or that data to technology, especially because we know that technology has errors. It's just like you probably have a cell phone or a computer that you have to restart sometimes, and it doesn't always work perfectly. And so technology doesn't. And to be quite honest, especially not healthcare technology, it's a newer field. We've got a lot of things that we're learning, and these things don't show up perfectly and work perfectly every time. So it makes sense to have hesitation. I think it's important that and I hope you've kind of figured so far, is that it's not uncommon, and you're not alone if you are afraid of starting a pump or you have fears around relying on a continuous glucose monitor. You are not alone. So many people reach that. And I can't think of anyone I know that started a pump for the first time and didn't have some concerns about it, didn't have some fears come up for them, kind of whether it was a limiting belief or it was a true fear or it was a hesitancy. I think a lot of people, we kind of have to work through those thoughts before we can get to a place where we feel safe to try something. I know absolutely for me, when I first started a continuous glucose monitor, this was the Dexcom, maybe G4. It looked like a little egg. And I was early into college. And when I started that, I was so nervous because I didn't know maybe what it would feel like for people to look at something I was wearing on my body and then have to tell them what it was or talk to them about diabetes because they saw it. I was concerned of what people would think, frankly. I think that that's also human nature. And so I kind of had to work through that. And that's true for any sensor technology. So the first kind of fear I'm going to talk about is that people are going to see that you have type 1 diabetes because you're wearing these things. And to some extent, honestly, now, especially some of the newer pumps, they're pretty easy to hide. So that's something that is helpful, is that if you really do have that hesitancy around people seeing the monitors on your body, you don't necessarily have to wear them in a place where most public can see them, maybe outside of wearing a bathing suit. So there are ways to cover them up, but that's not really the point. I mean, I think that if you're going to do something, it's important to feel good about it and understanding that it can be awkward at first to have conversations about tech on your body can be helpful. But if you are a person who's having trouble accepting the fact that you have type 1 diabetes and you are having concerns around talking about it with anybody in your life, whether it's someone newly that you meet or someone that you've known for a long time, and you're having the desire to hide the fact that you have type 1 diabetes from your life outside of your home, I think that's worth addressing first. I mean, I think that's so important to address. And by addressing it, I mean, really thinking through how that's going to work for you long term, because that used to be me. The first 6 months to a year that I had type 1 diabetes, I worked hard to hide that from people in my life. I was in middle school, and I remember that my mom had to send a letter, to my teachers about my diabetes. And I was just like, I remember being nauseous having to give the letter to my teacher because I thought my teacher was going to judge me for having diabetes. And I just didn't want anybody to know. I didn't tell any of my friends. I would pretend I had to go to the bathroom when I would leave my group of friends, and then I'd sneak off to the nurse to do my insulin. I mean, it was really something I had like intense fear about sharing. And then I ended up going to a camp for kids with diabetes, and it completely shifted my perspective on living with it and sharing it with other people. But before that, I lived in a lot more fear and anxiety than I needed to live in with this disease because I felt so ashamed of it. And the shame piece, I think, is also something we could talk more about. So when we think about that, I mean, if you look at your life today and you think about your future decades and years and kind of the next chapters of your life, it is, in my opinion, absolutely not worth carrying that fear of other people knowing you have diabetes through those chapters and bring a layer of stress into all of them. What is much easier, in my opinion, now that in retrospect, right, is learning to figure out how to own it in a way that feels good for you. And that's going to look totally different for everybody. But really making peace with it in a way where you feel like if someone asked you, hey, what's that thing on your arm? You could say, oh, I have type 1 diabetes. It's this great, sensor that measures my blood glucose and sends it to my phone and it gives me a graph. It's awesome, and feel good about it. So a lot of that has to come from, one, you have to backtrack and first learn how to feel good about type 1 diabetes in your life for you, in your own head, in your own thoughts. And then once you get good at that piece, it makes it easier to translate that out to other people. And where I got stuck was I felt like I wasn't okay with it in my own head. I was terrified of the fact that I had type 1 diabetes. When I was in middle school, I didn't even know what it meant. I didn't really understand you're going to have it for the rest of your life. I didn't really understand that you could not get held back in school or go to college or have your dream job or have kids. I didn't understand at all what it meant for my future. I didn't know if I was going to die earlier or last longer. I had so many gaps in my knowledge those first 6 months that I was so fearful. And that's, I think, a key, is that it was filling up the gaps in knowledge that helped me gain confidence to say, hey, actually, I can live a happy, healthy life with type 1 diabetes. And actually, it doesn't make me weird. I could be a cool kid, middle school, right? I could be a cool kid and have type 1 diabetes and it would still be fine. I could be who I wanted to be. I could excel in school like my friends. I could do what I wanted to do. And it wasn't because I was broken that I had it. And it wasn't because I did anything wrong or that I deserved it that I had it. It wasn't because something was not right with me. It just was the way I was, and it took me learning to accept that and just kind of be like, okay, this is where we are. These are the cards I'm dealt, and I'm going to create the best that I can out of it. Once I got there on my internal thought process, it was much easier than to answer those questions of what's that thing on your arm, And so I think that if you're not there and you have a fear of diabetes technology, that would be a great place to start, is really learning to make peace with that. I have a book on Amazon. It's called Type 1 Diabetes Mindset Reset, and it's just a workbook. It's pretty simple. I made it years ago, but it's kind of to walk you through trying to change or reframe some of those limiting beliefs about type 1 diabetes. So if you're stuck there, that could be a good resource for you. I'll link it below. But that's worth addressing first. And then the second type of fear I see that pops up around diabetes technology is the trust. Really worrying that insulin pump might give you too much insulin and you have a low and you didn't know about it and you didn't get to catch it in time. And so it did something to cause you harm. Or that continuous glucose monitor you were wearing that you've been bolusing off of all day was completely wrong, and now your blood sugars were high all day and you didn't even know it because it was reading your sensor wrong. Like, we have all these fears that come up about trusting these devices. And the first thing I want to say about that is that those fears are completely valid, but there's a way to use technology very safely. And when we look at these technology studies, the insulin pumps on the market in the US and the continuous glucose monitors, is that almost exclusively they show that you have better safety outcomes than if you were using just regular MDI, which we call multi-daily injections or shots, and finger prick. So the safety, technically, when we look at big groups of people who didn't use this technology and did use this technology, the ones using technology were safer. And that's worth knowing, because it might mean that if you chose to move forward with technology, you would be in that group where if you ended up like most people, you would be running a little bit safer. That's important. We also see general improvements and better outcomes. So lower A1C, less lows, less highs. So just better kind of overall, more managed blood glucose as well with technology. But safety is important because that's usually the piece that holds people back. So know that. And then I think understanding the device that you're choosing to try helps. Again, this is a knowledge gap piece. So if you understand the pump that you're going to try, how it works, when it's going to give you a basal rate, what happens if it doesn't give you a basal rate? Is it going to let you know? If the tubing gets kinked, how long is it going to take for it to give you an alarm to say, hey, we're not getting insulin through, so that you can think about those things. If you learn all the details of the pump that you're choosing, it will probably help you feel safer. So if you are unsure about trying a pump, you think you might want to, but you're having a lot of hesitancy, most medical practices will allow you to meet with the pharmaceutical rep for that company, where they can answer all your questions. They can sit down with you. They can teach you all about it. And then you can decide after you learn about it, whether or not it's the right fit for you to try. Also, some of them will let you do a free trial of things, especially, that's harder with some of them. Omnipod, at one point they had a 30-day free trial where it's non-committal. You just give it a month. You don't have to stick with it. And that's important to understand too, because I think that sometimes just trying something out, even if it were for a couple days, will answer a lot of your natural questions. Of course, you have to feel safe enough to do that. And that's why kind of the knowledge piece helps. If you understand how the pump works, it also then teaches you kind of by understanding how to use it in a way that's going to set you up for the most safety with these things. And so understanding safety is important to you is that really looking at, if you know how it works, you will then know how to use it, when to check on it, when to troubleshoot it, when to rip out the site, because you're thinking it's not working, and put in a new one. Those pieces, we've got a pretty solid understanding of how to do that in a way to keep yourself out of DKA. And so understanding the timing there, let's say if I know that I'm wearing a certain pump, and when my blood sugar is high for 3 hours and I've corrected twice and it's not moving, that's probably the right time. And this is a hypothetical example. That's probably the right time for this pump for my body that I learned with my doctor to pull out that site and then put in a new one. The other thing with these things is you are reliant on them. So creating habits where you can trust yourself to bring extra sensors where you go. A lot of people with insulin pumps, when they travel far outside of their house, so you could use an hour. If I was going to drive an hour outside of my house, I would bring backup supplies for my pump, so that if something happens to it that I didn't expect, I'm ready, to refill it, to keep going, to keep using it. So that's an option. People on pumps often always, well, I can't say that people always do this, but I would always recommend, if you are using an insulin pump and you're going to travel on vacation out of state, farther away, then the best thing to do would be to bring shots with you. So to have a backup long-acting insulin and short-acting insulin in a pen or a vial with syringes that you can bring with you. So anytime that pump stops working on you, you just go back to what you're doing now. And that's really, I think, a sense of safety, is that it's not hard to switch back, if something goes wrong. So that's helpful. And then just really then understanding too, how to prevent insulin from going in if you are having a lot of lows. So if you're having a lot of lows with where you are, and you feel like you're getting too much insulin, you will learn with your kind of setup process, or it would be the best to do this, how to stop the insulin so that you know how to do that. The thing that's different about shots, so long-acting and short-acting insulin versus a pump, is that the pump gives you both. So what makes it feel scary for a lot of people is that if your pump stops working, whether it's for many reasons, the battery dies, your sensor is kinked, it falls out, you don't know it, something happened, it will not give you insulin. So you will go from having insulin routinely to none. You will just have whatever's left over from your last kind of injections or what last entered your body. And so with that, you get to a place where when we have type 1 diabetes and we don't have insulin on board, that's when we start to create ketones. That's when our blood sugar spikes, but we also get that ketone process that's made quite quickly, and that puts us at risk for diabetic ketoacidosis. And that's the scary high blood sugar situation where you may need to go to the hospital. And so to prevent that, when you go onto a pump, it's really important to understand that if that pump stops working, you need insulin on board as soon as possible, right? So let's say you are on a day trip somewhere in a city near yours and your pump stops working at 11 a.m. You can't wait until you get home at 6 o'clock that night to take insulin again. That's not going to be a healthy situation at all. You're really going to have to say, okay, I've got to do something to replace not only the insulin I would take at a meal, but that basal rate, which is equivalent to the long-acting insulin. So that's another thing to think about, is that when you have the knowledge of, oh, that's what I have to do, then you can do it. And that takes away the safety issue. And so the issue, of not having insulin for an extended period of time. So those are things to think about. I think another thing that we kind of wonder about insulin pump technology is that the nighttime. A lot of people have, fears of going too low at night, and that's completely reasonable. But what we also know is that a lot of these newer pumps, if you're not familiar with kind of how the technology has evolved over the last couple of years, a lot of these newer pumps have what we call algorithms built in, which essentially means that your continuous glucose monitor that measures your blood sugar talks to the insulin pump, which chooses your basal rate, which is kind of how much of that baseline insulin you're getting. And it will help you increase or decrease that based on where your blood sugar is on the graph. So when you wear a continuous glucose monitor, it gives you data in a graph form, which is really nice because you can see, are you spiking? Are you dropping? You can catch lows before they happen. You can catch spikes, before you get all the way up to where you would be concerned. And so it's helpful, but they talk to each other. And so if you're dropping, it'll actually back off. A lot of these newer algorithm pumps will back off on the insulin. And if you're spiking, they'll give you a little bit more insulin to make that high less high than it would have been. And so that's really cool. That's helpful to know. So it actually can help prevent lows at nighttime, which is another pro in the safety category of being concerned about these. The other piece of continuous glucose monitor safety is how accurate they are. And that's something I think that is a question that I've heard come up since they first came out. And we get to this place of blood sugar technology isn't perfect, and the way that we measure blood sugar isn't going to be 100% accurate, at least for the future I can see. I mean, it's really hard to be 100% accurate. We're doing the best that we can. And in my opinion, these sensors are doing quite well. We've got standards that we're running each company by as far as FDA approval. And are they good enough to keep us safe? Yes. Do they keep us safer than finger prick? In my opinion, absolutely yes. Because we can set alarms when on those graphs, we can kind of set thresholds for alarms so it can tell us before we get low. It can tell us before we get high. And that can help us preemptively give an injection or treat the low so that we don't get all the way, high or low that we would have if we hadn't interacted sooner. And so that is something that is really helpful. Now, I recommend calibrating these things. So just because you're wearing a continuous glucose monitor doesn't mean you can't finger prick. And in fact, it's recommended. Some of them have FDA approvals that say that you don't need to calibrate, which just means checking your finger on your regular meter you're using now, and then looking at the blood sugar on the graph and saying, is this the same? Is this different? That's essentially what calibrating is. Some of them you can type that blood sugar in and it'll adjust, others you can't. But the point is you want to check on the graph, make sure it's right? Make sure it's accurate. Sometimes things can happen, right? Maybe your sensor comes out of your body a little bit. And so because it's sticking out a little bit, it's not measuring as deeply, it's not going to get the same numbers. Sometimes they're just off, to be honest, and that's not something that is unusual. I've had plenty of sensors where I'm like, this one just doesn't seem to be accurate in the beginning. Sometimes in the first 24 hours, it's going to be less accurate than the rest of the time that you're wearing the sensor. There are all these things that you can learn, but the thing about wearing a glucose monitor or a continuous glucose monitor is that you can always go back to finger prick, which is what you're doing now, and use those numbers. So if you're worried about trusting it, what you could do is you could wear one continue to finger prick as you are. Use that information, the finger prick information, to make insulin decisions and low blood sugar treatment decisions like you currently are, and just watch the graph and just kind of get used to it. And then over time, what happens to, I think, most of us is we learn to trust it. You still want to calibrate it. You still want to check on it because there are going to be times where it's off. And that's kind of just where we are. But understanding that that's okay, right? Because we can then understand that it's off a little bit and make an adjustment on how we would treat things. I recommend calibrating your sensor, and really for all of the companies right now, once a day, because that will keep you safe, especially if you calibrate it in the morning. And the reason for that is that you've been sleeping all night. You're probably not going to be spiking hugely or dropping quickly when you wake up, just because you've been fasted for a while. And so because of that, you're more likely to calibrate during a flat line on that graph, and that's the best time to see things. Something that would be helpful to know about glucose monitors, and I see this kind of lost in translation sometimes for people who are wearing them, is that these things measure glucose differently. They measure through what we call your interstitial fluid, which is the fluid in between your cells, kind of around your cells. And so what happens is that fluid is going to look a little bit different than your blood sugar, but it converts it to what a blood sugar number would be for the graph. And so it sounds confusing, but it's really not in the way that you use it. It's just important to understand that it's about 10 minutes behind where your blood sugar currently is. And so let's say I am 120, and then, I don't want to use perfect numbers all the time. Let's go, I'm 220, and then I feel myself, let's say I gave a correction, and I feel myself dropping, and I can kind of see it on the graph, and I'm like 180, and then I'm 150, and then I drop all the way down, I'm getting closer, I'm 100, and then I'm 80, but I already feel like I'm 60. If you look at that graph and you say, in 10 minutes, this graph is probably going to look like I'm 60 and I feel 60, you probably are 60 because it's 10 minutes behind. Same thing for spiking. So if you're spiking, you can kind of say, okay, it's going to be 10 minutes behind. I could be higher than I actually am. And that confuses people, because if you're just comparing, if you're on a up or down trend and you're comparing your finger prick to the graph, it might look like it's off, right? But it's going to be 10 minutes behind. So look to see, does that make sense? If I tested when I was dropping and my graph says I'm 80 and I finger pricked and I was 60, is that sensor wrong? No, it's just doing what it's supposed to do. It's going to be 10 minutes behind. So think about that when you're looking into this, because that's also helpful in interpretation, but also tells you kind of what to do. There are times where if I know that I am dropping and my sensor doesn't say I'm low yet, I'll go ahead and treat, and then I'll watch it for a while. And if I was, wrong, or if I didn't quite get the way I was feeling right, then I'll, correct for that treatment. But listen to your body, listen to your finger prick before you listen to these sensors. And if you follow those rules, I think you can stay very safe. So this video is getting long. I hope this is helpful. Please know you're not alone if you're afraid of this stuff. It is so interesting that we are humans learning to trust our health in technology. This is kind of, I think, a new thing for humanity. We live in a weird world that we're even having to make decisions about that. That's where we are. But I just want you to know that a lot of us are doing it out there safely, maybe even safer than we were before. It's possible. I've seen a lot of people have so much hesitation and fear around these technologies and then get to a place where they absolutely love them. So know that it's possible to kind of have that 180 on how you feel about them, and know that knowledge usually helps you feel better, whether it's knowledge about what diabetes means for your life and your future that makes you feel more accepting of having type 1 diabetes and more accepting of who you are with it, and that these are your cards, and knowledge of kind of how to talk about it with people in a way that feels empowering and not like, oh, they're all going to feel sorry for me. That type of knowledge is really important. And then knowledge of the technology, because when you understand it, you can feel confident in how to use it in a way that's going to keep you as safe as possible. And I think that is really the key. So please let me know if you have any questions about this. I love talking about the mindset part of this, because that's, I think, where maybe the rubber meets the road. It's like we can have all the best technology, but if we can't feel good about it, then what's the point, you know? And so please let me know if you have any questions or if this brings up anything for you. I would love for you to subscribe if you haven't already. My intention is to create more videos talking about mindset and medicine as it relates to type 1 diabetes. So please subscribe or send this video to somebody if you know they're also worried about these kind of things. Know that you're not alone, and I appreciate you sticking till the end. Thanks so much.